Well, thank you very much. How about a hand for our speakers? Good evening. I'm Jack Daly, the director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and it's my honor to welcome you here for what is truly a special event. Since it was inaugurated in 2004, the lecture that we are going to hear this evening, which is the John H. Glenn Space Lecture, has become one of the museum's most popular events. The program supports the museum's mission in many ways, and it's named for an individual who is known throughout the world for the role he played in the history of the aviation and space programs. Each year, a figure or a team distinguished in the fields of space exploration and space science is invited to deliver the lecture. As it was last year, this year's lecture is made possible by the generous support of the Boeing Company. With us tonight is Mr. Tim Keating, Senior Vice President for Public Policy at Boeing. And Tim, where are you? Would you please stand and be recognized? Without this support, these lectures would not be possible. They're all sponsored by generous donors, and Boeing has been a longtime supporter of this museum in many ways. And with the construction of Phase 2 at the Hazy Center underway, and in recognition of the very generous donation they gave us for that, the Boeing Company's name is on the main aviation hangar out there. It's the Boeing Aviation Hangar. We're very proud of that, and we do appreciate the continuing support that we get from you. Thank you very much, Tim. One of the reasons for the success of the John H. Glenn Lecture is its namesake, who is here with us tonight. Although he needs no introduction, I'd like to say a few words to welcome one of the National Air and Space Museum's greatest friends and supporters. Before joining the space program, he served his country in the United States Marine Corps with 59 combat missions in World War II, 63 missions in Korea, then as a test pilot, setting the transcontinental speed record in the F-8U-1P, which is similar to the one we have on display out at the Hazy Center. One of the original 7 Mercury astronauts made his famous orbital flight in Friendship 7 in 1962. 36 years later, he returned to space on a shuttle mission as the crew's most mature member, with the exalted title of Payload Specialist 2. Between space flights, as a member of the U.S. Senate, his commitment to public service continued for more than a quarter century. Now, when many of his generation might be enjoying a life of leisure, he is participating in educational activities and inspiring future generations of space explorers at the John Glenn Institute for Public Service and Public Policy at Ohio State University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Payload Specialist 2, John Glenn.
Thank you. On that mission, the only 2 people on board lower than I was in the pecking order were the 2 toadfish that were in the cargo bay. Someone referred to this the other day as a memorial lecture. Not quite, not yet. No. Stick with it here. It's always a pleasure to come here, and Jack has been so innovative with this whole thing. You know, we ought to figure out some way to have him honored one of these times here. I think he's done the greatest job of putting together what I think is the finest aviation museum and memorabilia concentration, most diverse, certainly, of any place in the world that I know of. And I think he deserves a big hand, too. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to participate in every one of these programs so far. And this year, the museum is honoring the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 8 mission and the accomplishments of its crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. Not just because of the occasion tonight, but I've said this repeatedly, I think the Apollo 8 mission is one of the most important missions of the whole NASA experience. And I don't say that just because we're here tonight. It was a very, very unusual mission, about which we'll hear a lot later on. The mission departed December 21st and returned December 28, 1968. It was the first time that humans left the vicinity of Earth. and traveled to another world. And I think the things that we'll hear them describe this evening will show what faith they had in the engineers and the people they were working with, and the crew and the team and the equipment and everything else. And we will be hearing a great deal about the mission, but let me just set the stage with a few historical facts. Apollo 8 was not originally planned as a moon mission. NASA's plan was to do an Earth orbital mission. But in September 1968, the Soviets sent Zond 5 to pass by the moon. It carried and returned to Earth a payload of turtles, wine flies, and mealworms. Now that's quite a character. Now, I don't know if there's any similarity between those three types of cargoes and the ones that occurred later on when the U.S. sent them up or not, but Borman, Lovell, and Anders were a step up from turtles, wine flies, and mealworms. There's no doubt about that. And when it brought them back to Earth, of course, the USSR repeated the feat in November with Zond 6. The space race competition to land humans on the moon, the goal set by President Kennedy in '61, seemed to be heating up considerably. And after the successful Earth orbit mission of Apollo 7, the time seemed right for a bolder, a riskier mission, a voyage to the moon. Reportedly, even the Apollo 8 astronauts rated their chances of success at no better than 50-50, that they're willing to go. Before Apollo 8, the U.S. had flown only 17 missions in space. Only 17. And only 22 different astronauts before that had gained spaceflight experience. Of those, Apollo 8 Commander Frank Borman and Command Module Pilot Jim Lovell had flown more hours than any other astronauts. Indeed, together, they had more hours than all Soviet cosmonauts combined. They flew together on Gemini 7, a 2-week endurance test in which they lived together in a cabin the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. After recovery, Jim Lovell joked, "I want to announce our engagement." It's my understanding, too, from rumors going around that the sanitary conditions would not have passed OSHA minimums. They were ready for Apollo 8. So, too, was Bill Anders, William Anders, making his very first flight. A graduate of the Naval Academy, an experienced pilot, recipient of a master's degree in nuclear engineering. He served as lunar module pilot for the mission. Unfortunately for him, the mission did not carry a lunar module. Engineering problems had delayed its availability. But in this next statement, it may be a little bit controversial to some of the crew beside Bill Anders, but as Apollo 8 orbited the moon, Bill had to be content with making one of the most historic photographs of the 20th century, the incomparable image of the Earth rising over the lunar surface. There'll be a little contention on that, perhaps. The public build-up to Apollo 8 was tremendous. A worldwide audience anticipated the mission. Launched just before the Christmas holidays, the mission balanced the tension of the space race with a transcendent feeling that the accomplishment was truly for all humanity. Live television broadcast by the astronauts while orbiting the moon brought the adventure to almost a quarter of all people living on Earth by best estimates. And the very memorable Christmas Eve scripture reading is something that none of us that heard that at that time, including many of you here, will ever forget. The success of the mission paved the way a few months later for Apollo 11, for Neil, Buzz, and Mike going to the moon, landing of humans on the moon, fulfilling President Kennedy's challenge to the nation. So it's really my pleasure not only to be here tonight, but to look forward to hearing some of the recounting of what happened on Apollo 8. And it's my pleasure to welcome the Apollo 8 astronauts and Dr. Martin Collins, curator in the museum's Division of Space History. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you.
Take any seats.
Are we standing or sitting?
We're going to sit. Give us a few moments while we rearrange the stage here a little bit. I'm Martin Collins, the curator here at the museum, and I'll be helping to moderate a discussion with our speakers tonight as much as is possible. Please, while we do the talk, do not use flash photography. It is a little bit distracting sitting up here. And there'll be perhaps a moment towards the end of the lecture when you can take more pictures. Well, that's a heck of an introduction to follow. Let me, we have the image up on the screen. Let me set the stage just a little bit more before we enter into a conversation with the Apollo 8 crew. One of the things that's tremendously difficult to do is to remember back in time and think what it was really like in 1968. For many of us, especially younger members in the audience, this is a period of time which is completely unknown to them, something that is only sort of read about in history books and not remembered. And one of the things that is so sort of fundamental to sort of understanding that time period, in the 1960s especially, is the context of the Cold War and how deeply that touched every corner of America. And the image you see on the screen of this Time magazine cover that was issued in December 1968, in the early days of that month, just before this flight, gives you a deep sense of what that conflict was like, the intensity of it. Our contest with the Soviets was something that took place under every kind of social endeavor and took place in every sort of corner of the earth, from Antarctica to the Arctic, from Europe to Asia to South America. And especially, as you can see in this image, it took us on land, under sea, and into space. And space became really one of the dominant symbols of that conflict with the Soviet Union, and so perfectly sort of captured in this image. 1 month later, after the flight, that image had been turned around a little bit, and we see the three faces of our distinguished speakers up there. They were Time Magazine's Men of the Year 1 month later. A face had been put on those anonymous astronauts that we saw in early December. And what they were recognizing, of course, was the accomplishments of these men, men who were deeply loyal to their country, deeply professional, and had tough-mindedness and a sense of grace and elegance under pressure. And if any of you ever go online and listen to the transcripts of the communications during this mission, you will see what incredible grace was indicated as they went about their mission, talked about it, and interacted with one another. It really is a striking thing, and I recommend that to people. So what we see here is not only a recognition of these men, but also in designating them as Men of the Year, capturing something of that moment in 1968. It is a kind of looking back at that year, as John Glenn was starting to say, indicating that this flight represented something transcendent, something that provided a counterpoint to all of the things that happened during that year of 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the troubles in Vietnam, and troubles in the streets of America. So this flight was always seen by the public and by publications like Time Magazine as something that was fit into that moment in time and not something that stood apart from it. So tonight our discussion is going to look at what they accomplished and also to encourage you to kind of think about the meaning of that event. One thing it's important to convey in all this, of course, is just the sheer immensity of this effort. And one way of conveying that is recognizing, and I hope they forgive me, this is an image of the Apollo 11 launch we see behind us, not Apollo 8. Is that when you look up at the very top of that rocket, you see a small conical structure. That is the place where these three human beings, fragile creatures, were positioned atop this monster rocket, a Saturn V, the first time humans had ridden on a Saturn V. A striking kind of accomplishment, a striking moment, one of the striking firsts of Apollo 8. And you can kind of picture and imagine what this experience was like to be on top of that rocket heading off to the moon. And this was the character of their trip. You leave Earth, and I know this is schematic, is maybe a little bit confusing. Bill told me not to use it, but here it is. It just gives you an indication that essentially they were flying a figure 8 to the moon. Leave Earth, arc out around the moon, and come back. They spent about 20 hours in lunar orbit and then headed back to the Earth. But in that sort of simple discretion is a very large tale, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. Maybe a place to begin here is to ask Frank to give us a little bit of a sense of how the idea for the Apollo 8 mission began and how it sort of took shape in the months of the summer months of 1968.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you all for being here, and John, for your generous introduction. We were assigned to the excuse me, third Apollo mission. Was supposed to have been a long duration, relatively long durations, exercising the lunar module and command module in Earth orbit out to 8,000 miles. And then in December, while we were out at Downey, California, going through the systems with the spacecraft, I got a call from Deke Slayton, our boss, who said, "Come back. We've had a change in plans." And he informed me that the CIA had informed NASA that they would be probably be a Soviet attempt to go around the moon before the end of the year, and they wanted to know if we could. This was in August. They wanted to know if we could change our mission, train, and be able to go. I immediately said yes, because I knew that Bill and Jim would have, were dying for the chance to do this. And then we came back, and you've had the outline of what happened after that. But interestingly enough, the saga of Apollo 8 really should begin, the Apollo program should begin with a fire in January of 1967 that killed 3 astronauts, threw the whole program into disarray. And out of that terrible tragedy, I'm convinced came the genesis of the Apollo program that was so successful. And the man that was really responsible for that was a man named George Low, who was appointed Apollo program manager, brought order out of chaos, imposed an iron discipline on the program, and in a very gentle way. I think it was gentle. I always just said yes, sir, and did it. But his widow is here tonight. Mary, I just don't think that anybody recognized what the program owes, what the country owes to George Low, and I just wanted to acknowledge that, Mary Arm. And then I'll just say one other thing, and then I'll shut up. But one of the beauties of working for NASA at this time was it wasn't bureaucratic. It wasn't bureaucratic at all. I remember for one time, when I first went out to the Apollo mock-up, and I flew the simulator, I pulled the stick back, and the nose went down. I pushed the stick forward, and the nose went up. I called the engineer over, North American engineer over, and I said, "Hey, you got the polarity screwed up on this. This is, look, what's happening?" He said, "Oh, that's the way we're going to fly it. All the human engineers, human effects, human resource, human factors resource. This is the way it's going to be." I said, "What do you mean? I never flown an airplane like this." He said, "Oh, you're not going to fly the airplane. You're going to fly the target. See, when you pull back, the target will go up." And so I said, "Huh? Okay." So I didn't argue with him. He's been very proud of me. I just went over and called NASA in Houston. I said, "Look, these idiots have got it all screwed up." And a half an hour later, it was changed. They didn't have a committee. They didn't have anything at all. It just was changed. And that was because of people like George Low. It was wonderful. And the whole concept of changing our mission and getting ready in 4 months was done because of that. We were in that program, the Can-Do program, beat the Soviets to the moon. Yeah, the NASA now likes to talk about scientific exploration, and our lunar expert here, Bill Andrew, we pick up all the rocks in the world. It's just wonderful. The reason we went to moon on Apollo 8 was to beat the Russians. I want to give you a clue. Okay, Martin.
Nothing changes.
Maybe all of you could say a little bit more about how the fact of that tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire changed your preparations or affected your preparations as you were thinking about the Apollo 8 mission.
Well, let me just add that I think the fire, which was a real tragedy, I think spurred the NASA team and everybody working harder and harder to get the job done and get a Block 2 command module that would be ready in time to fly. We all thought at the time of the fire that what's going to happen to our whole Apollo program. And it turned out that the dedication of all the people working together made it a case whereby we fixed and we improved our vehicle such that it was possible to go to the moon on Apollo 8, actually to go flying on Apollo 7, which was the precursor. And part of the decision that was made when Frank went to Houston, and Bill and I were still out at Downey wondering what happened to Frank, was the fact that the decision would go on Apollo 8 to the moon if Apollo 7 was successful. So in reality, that flight proved the improvements of the command module from the disastrous fire that we had in 1967. And that was the spur that allowed us to make that final decision after Apollo 7 to say, yes, let's go. Although we were training for the lunar mission prior to the Apollo 7 flight.
Well, I just think that Apollo 7 was one of the more unappreciated flights from the public. Wally Schirra was the commander. Don Isley was the command module pilot, and Walt Cunningham was the lunar module pilot, though like me, he didn't have a lunar module. And Wally got a cold and was a little grumpy, and his flight controllers didn't like it, but they did a heck of a job, and just recently NASA finally came around to presenting that crew with the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, and I had the honor of presenting it to Joe Schirra, Wally's widow. But that was an important flight. And that flight was successful because Frank, spent an awful lot of time making sure that command module was safe.
John was awful generous in saying how important Apollo 8 was, and then Bill just mentioned Apollo 7 being so important. But in reality, every damn flight was important. Think of John Glenn sitting on top of an ICBM, really an aluminum inner tube, because it wouldn't hold it without air. Isn't that correct? You had to have pressure in that thing or you'd collapse. So NASA's program wasn't haphazard. It didn't just happen. It was planned every step of the way, and it was remarkable that it worked. I honestly believe that God was shining on us from the very beginning.
If we hadn't had the fire, we probably wouldn't have had the lunar landing.
That's probably right.
You had just 4 months to cram all of your training in to do Apollo 8. What was a typical day like as you went through that training regimen to get ready for the flight?
Well, there were some changes of training that we obviously had to do. We had to start learning the lunar surface of the moon's topography to see the various craters. And this is sort of interesting because we brought in people who were familiar with that to teach us some of the initial points, because the mission of Apollo 8 was really to check the navigation and to check for suitable landing spots, the flat areas, the mare of the sea, that would give the people who would attempt the first landing the greatest chance of survival. And consequently, our photography and looking around at those flat areas, like the Sea of Tranquility, which Apollo 11 eventually landed on, that was one of our missions, and that was part of our training. And also, we had to do things that, in a three-dimensional effect, navigation was one of them, because we were not going around the Earth anymore. We were going to have to test out the navigation system on the way to the moon to see how accurate it was, and this, of course, was the test flight of that particular aspect. Bill?
Yeah.
Why don't you describe the launch? People don't know yet.
Well, Frank asked me to describe the
I
launch.
didn't ask you.
He told me to. You'd think a major general would have a little more stroke here with a colonel.
A major general in the reserves.
But, of course, I was the rookie of the flight. Of course, I like to say that everybody was a rookie on the first Saturn V. But we trained for every possible emergency that we could think of, every possible environment. We had centrifuges. We did survival training in the jungles, in the desert, in the ocean. We were on the centrifuge up to 15 Gs. Everything you could think of. We had a thing called the launch abort trainer, which rattled around a bit, and Frank, whose job it was to decide
whether he would abort, had a handle that would fire the abort system. But nobody had ridden on the Saturn V, and even though there'd been, 2 unmanned Saturns, apparently they didn't have the accelerometers in the right place, because they no sooner lit this thing off when I realized that we had missed one major part of the simulation. The sideways vibration with those big, huge 1.5 million pound thrust each engines, gimbling around, trying to keep this thing straight. The center of gravity was way down here. We were up here like a ladybug on the end of your automobile antenna. So as it moved down here an inch, this thing moved a foot. And I literally felt like I was being thrashed around like a rat in the jaws of a terrier. And I was convinced that the fins were bouncing up the girders of the spacecraft, of the launch tower. Also, the noise was deafening. There was no way we could communicate. Now, Frank, he told me later, was smart enough to take his hand off this launch abort handle, because as fighter pilots, it's much better to die than it is to screw up. And that's why we're all short, but there was no way. If I detected, I was sort of the flight engineer, and so if I detected any kind of problem on the instruments, I couldn't see them. They were just kind of going like that. I wouldn't have been able to communicate them to Frank, and if I had seen them and communicated, he wouldn't be able to do anything about it anyway. Well, it seemed like an hour when we cleared the tower, and the noise started coming down a little bit, and things smoothed out, and I thought, boy, if we missed that in our training, what else have we missed? So it was pretty spectacular. And then as we burned the fuel out of this first stage, it's extremely heavy, probably half of the weight of the vehicle. That's when it was loaded. As it burned its fuel down, the whole thing became much less massive. But the thrust was the same. For those who went to high school physics, F equals ma. So as F is the same and m goes down, a goes up. So at cutoff, what do we have? About 4 Gs, something like that, 4.5 Gs. Suddenly, the rocket cut off. Instantaneously, some retro rockets fired. Then a primer cord sheared off the first stage. To me, where my fluid, we were on our backs, so the fluid in my ears were pinned to the back of my head. And suddenly it all sloshed forward. And I could not resist throwing my hand up in front of my face. It felt like I was being catapulted, like one of these Captain of Castile catapults, right through the instrument panel. Okay, and so I threw my hand up. About the time my hand got up here, the second stage cut in. Whack! So I looked up and I had my helmet on, and here was this gash across my helmet. And I thought, oh gosh, when the big boys see this, it's going to just, justify the rookie position. Well, we made it into orbit, and somewhere along the line, I collected the helmets, and I noticed that the other 2 guys each had a slash. So my point is, there's no rookies on the first Saturn V. Everybody's a rookie. But it was a heck of a vehicle, and to the credit of Werner von Braun's team down at Huntsville, they built one heck of a rocket. And I think part of the problem with NASA today is they just don't have that kind of capability anymore. And it's going to be hard to see. Interesting to see if they can come up with another Saturn V, but this time with digital technology, not analog.
Well, the thing that we might, since you probably are, I hope you're interested in hearing a little bit about the flight route too, but the launch was exciting. And then we went onto the coast. We went around once and a half around the Earth, and then over Hawaii, wasn't it? We got the go for TLI, go for translunar injection. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't think we would ever get that, because I knew darn well that NASA wouldn't commit us unless everything was really perfect. But over Hawaii, Mike Collins said, Apollo 8, you go for TLI. We lit the S4B, started out, picked up, 25,000 miles an hour?
35,000 feet a second.
35,000 feet a second, 25,000 miles an hour, and started toward the moon. Now, in order to keep the heat load equal on the spacecraft,
if that was the sun, we positioned ourselves perpendicular to the sun and then just rotated all the way to the moon. I think we probably have the record for revolutions.
Yeah.
And it kept,
Barbecue mode.
yeah, we called it the barbecue mode. About, I don't know, about 2 or 3. I might as well get this out of the way right now because it'll come up sooner or later.
And it came up.
I began to feel funny.
I'll tell you, it wasn't a bit funny.
You know, Jim Lovell and I had flown for 2 weeks, and I'd never gotten sick. I'd never been sick in an airplane, but I really wasn't feeling too good. And so I managed to throw up all over him. And that caused great consternation back on Earth when Anders wanted to squeal on me. I wouldn't let him. So finally he dumped it on the tape, and they read about it. And then
8 hours later, I covered his tail for 8 hours.
But interestingly enough, all the scientists, and Dr. Van Allen was convinced that we got fried going through his ionosphere belt. This, not the doctors were going nuts, and we wanted, as if they couldn't decide whether or not they were going to abort the mission. They didn't have much to say about it. Really.
Frank, I have to tell you this right now, but we were going to the moon regardless of what happened here.
Exactly. That's my point.
We
No
had
matter what they said, we were on our way.
Right,
Jim had broken out the rubber bag to put him in.
you know.
But anyway, I got over it in a big hurry, and then we did that for about 3 days, and then I'll just talk about inserting it into the.
Well,
lunar
before you
module.
go there, Frank.
Hey, we're already to the moon here, Frank. I haven't even taken off
Yeah,
yet.
we need
I'm going to let you talk at the moon.
without getting into too much gory detail. Jim and I were up in the operational part. Frank was down in the navigation bay, and out of the navigation bay came this blob, kind of greenish, yellowish. And as a physicist, it intrigued me because it had this three-dimensional oscillation. And Jim was sitting over here, and we were both fascinated by it, you know, and I was thinking, God, I ought to get a picture of that, you know, and then it split.
Let me,
wait a minute, it's my story, and it's not quite true, but it's still a good story. And the conservation momentum would say that when it split, you know, part would go one way, and the other would part. So it was kind of hitting this, and one part went this way, and the other part went right towards Jim. And I'll never forget, his eyes just came in like that, like a fried egg on his chest. You owe him one, Frank.
That's true, but I thought I'd regress just a little bit because I want to mention something of my thoughts. When we were told that we were going to go to the moon, we were planning and we're training and we're doing everything. You know, sometimes you get into a project that you really never quite see the end. You're working hard, you forget about the final part, the completion. And that to me was sort of the way I felt. We're going to the moon, we're training this, we're doing that, we're learning something else. And then it was on the day of the launch, before light, it was still dark when the three of us went up to the gantry. Now you have to remember that there's no one else around except a couple nervous checkout people. The rocket itself is filled with 5.5 million pounds of high explosives. Everyone else is a comfortable 3.5 miles away. And as my two companions were the first to go into the spacecraft, where the gantry is some 330 feet tall, there's a bridge across there. They walked across it and they went into the spacecraft. I was left alone, fully suited up and breathing pure oxygen. And I looked at the night and I saw these lights come down, and this was the press corps that was manning the press sites at that particular time. And then I looked down and I saw the ground, and I looked at the press corps and I said, these people are really serious. We're going to go to the moon. And you know, it suddenly dawned on me that this was not another Earth orbital flight. This was the accumulation of the training we had done and the decisions we had made, that unless something in the next couple hours happened, this spacecraft and this rocket were going to take off, and we're headed for the moon.
Yeah, before they interrupted me, we were on our way to the moon, if you remember. And one of the important things on the flight plan was when we would lose communication with the Earth, because as you go around the moon, the communications would be blanked out because it was S-band radar that we were using to communicate.
And so that was a very critical point. We had never seen the moon, as John mentioned. And I was really, it was perfect darkness, and we were flying backwards, aiming 240,000 miles, aiming for a place 60 miles above the lunar surface. So I was watching that time very, very, very closely and hoping that we were on track. And just at the minute we were supposed to lose communication, we lost it. And I thought, boy, that's great. What a wonderful deal. I said, we just lost it right on time. And Anders says, well, they probably turned the damn radio off. Okay, now I got you to the moon. You guys take over.
Well, as Frank said and as John said, we didn't see the moon because we weren't supposed to look at it because the sun was sort of right behind it. Afraid that we'd hurt our eyes. But when we oriented the spacecraft going backwards along our path, just as we were cutting in front of the moon, like high schoolers trying to outrace the train in their jalopy and beating it by a yard, we went into the shadow of the moon, where we were both in the shadow of the moon from the sun and the shadow of the moon from Earthshine. And it was dark. I mean, it had been kind of just, the sky was sort of a gray. You couldn't see stars very well, but it wasn't dark coming to the moon. But now it was black. There were stars everywhere. You couldn't tell which ones they were. There were so many. And I remember looking back and seeing all these stars, and suddenly there was this big black hole. And I got to tell you, the hair went up on the back of my neck, because that was the moon. And when we popped out of that shadow and relit our engines, we were in lunar orbit.
That was one of the major decisions we had to make because, if we had any problems at all, we'd circumnavigate the moon and come back again. So one of the decisions, and what we had to do behind the moon with no communication with the Earth, was to, of course, light the engine to slow down. And once we did that and everything looked perfect, and then when we looked at the computer, it showed that we were in the exact orbit. I think at that time it was about 60 by 160 miles in a sort of elliptical orbit to begin with. So everything on this particular flight up to now was working perfectly.
Well, tell us what you were thinking.
Well, I'll continue, yes, because, first of all, Bill Anders will always mention that he was the first one to get to the moon because he was in a position whereby he was a few centimeters ahead of us as he rotated the spacecraft.
Mark Spitz, first is first,
No, wait. The reason is we were flying backwards and he had a bigger butt. That's the only.
Whatever it takes.
But when
First
we
around the
finally
moon.
came into the Earthshine, or sunshine, actually, we came out, I think we were best expressed as three school kids looking through a candy store window. The flight plan was forgotten for a few moments. Our noses were pressed to the glass, and we were all looking at those ancient old craters on the far side of the moon, which, of course, as you all know, we don't see from the Earth. And to see what they were and how they were, we were just 60 miles above the moon at that time. And I think that's one of the great impressions I've had in the first instances of actually becoming a satellite of the moon.
Well, another example, though, of the NASA of that day, and I think all three of us, and I'm sure John would feel too, we were at the right place at the right time. It was a wonderful organization. But we didn't just go around the 10 orbits around the moon, happenstance. Because of the press of time, I met with Chris Kraft and 2 or 3 of his people one afternoon. The flight controllers wanted us to stay up there for a month so that they could really track us. I wanted to stay up there about 30 seconds so we could get home. But out of that meeting, and the meeting lasted about 4 hours, came that whole flight plan. And I just can't think today. I'm sure there'd be committees, there'd be this, there'd be that, there'd be probably doctors and science.
Senate oversight, and
Senate oversight, yeah. It was wonderful because we had giants, George Lowe, Chris Kraft, Gilruth. We were very, very lucky people.
Amen.
Talk a little bit about the photography plan for the mission.
Well, Frank insisted that I take a lot of photography. Now, Frank was not a great photography fan, but NASA definitely wanted us to shoot the shots of the lunar surface, and they had a plan that greatly exceeded even my ability to follow. Jim was busy photographing along the flight paths through the navigation system, and I was shooting right, left, one thing that I don't think we had a light meter. The NASA had calculated what the reflected light would be depending on our longitude, which depend on our time. And so I just checked the clock and I'd turn it F this or F that. And so we got a lot of good pictures of the lunar surface. Related to that, I had named a bunch of craters before the flight. Didn't ask anybody, didn't ask Frank. Picked a nice big one for him, slightly lesser one, and then a well-formed, a small one for me. And all the politicians that were involved, you know, the crater naming guys threw all that out. John, there ought to be an investigation. You know, right? But I picked them, at least mine, so it was just over the other side of the lunar horizon, so that we could see it, but nobody else from Earth could. So it wouldn't have been named, but we could talk about it. So I talked a lot about coming over Anders and photographing it, and Borman and Lovell and Gil Ruth, and I even named one after you, John. So,
Bill, the crater that named for you was actually named Tsiolkovsky, so I don't think, and the Russians got it ahead of you.
well, interesting that when they finally did honor us and the Apollo 11 crew with actually named craters, and they had, of course, picked 6 Russians who hadn't even been there. They picked the one place in the moon in that double shadow that we couldn't see. I may almost think they did it deliberately, you know. I'll catch those guys.
You know, this is kind of interesting because, as Bill said, he was doing all this with photography, and I wanted him to be studying the systems, doing this. So I said, Anders, forget about those pictures. Don't worry about it. But we'll be able. And he was doing all this on the sly in the sauna, without anybody knowing about it. But actually, I think that was probably the most important evidence that we brought back was the photography. And Jim and Bill did it all.
Yeah, we did most of the flight at Roswell, Area 51. We did have a few.
You know, that's something else we ought to clear up right now. There's been a lot of. Every time we go anywhere, we get talks about UFOs. I just want to go on record now, me speaking personally. I don't think there is a UFO. I've never seen a UFO. I think it's nonsense, and I want everybody to understand that, please.
Well, I want to mention something about photography.
Well, I would
Because
just say that the Air Force made us swear to say that.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that as we orbited, we saw all these craters and we saw other things. And there was a little triangular mountain on the coast along the shoreline of the Sea of Tranquility that I felt sure that no one had ever named. But to double check, I said, Bill, is there a name on this little triangular mountain? He said, I don't think so. I said, Frank, what do you think about this little triangular mountain? And he said, I don't know. I said, I'm naming it Mount Maryland. And so that name stuck with, informally, that's my wife, by the way, and the Apollo 11 crew used it as an IP when they made their initial landing down there.
I didn't know that. Is that right?
Yeah. I just want to let you know, Commander.
It's now called Tsiolkovsky, too.
Let's talk about Earthrise. How did that picture happen? Tell us the circumstances.
Well,
Frank and I are going to go out for a drink.
Well, we were in a 160 by 60 mile orbit on the first 3 orbits and going backwards. And so, you know, we never saw the Earth. We'd pop around and we're looking at the lunar surface and we were upside down. And so on the 3rd rev, I believe, we circularized. We burned the engine again, slowed us down even further to lower the apogee of the high point of the orbit down to 60 miles circular. And Frank then turned the spacecraft around, sort of like it ought to be, going forward. And we were coming around on this 3rd revolution, and I was taking pictures over here. Jim was asleep. I'm not even sure what he was doing. And I think Frank yelled out, "Look," or something. And here was this gorgeous thing coming up over the lunar horizon, the back side of the moon, much rougher than the front side of the moon. And so, boy, there was a mad scramble for cameras. Each guy had one, started firing off. I was lucky because I had one with a long lens and color film. And I just kept snapping and turning the f-stop. And each of the guys took the same view but different size lenses, and it just so happened that NASA picked the one I took as the iconic Earthrise picture. But frankly, even though they both claimed they took it, they know who did. But I consider it kind of a crew picture.
We've talked about being in orbit now, and one of the more exciting parts of the mission from my standpoint was lighting the rocket to get us home. Otherwise, we'd still be there. On the 10th revolution, behind the moon, we lit the rocket, for about 4 or 5 minutes. Worked perfectly, and we started home. And go ahead, James.
Well, I have to get into detail here because we're in the far side of the moon, and we have to light this engine, otherwise we'll be captured permanently as a satellite of the moon. And so my job was to actually do the work through the computer, and we had a signal, or actually numbers on the computer that got down to 5 seconds before it should be lit, and it said something like, "Do you really want to make this maneuver?" This gave you a little bit of a chance to say, "Hey, I don't want to do this," to think about it. And so I hesitated with my finger, and Borman says, "Push the button, push the button."
Frank has already spoken about the issue of loss of signal and how important that is to know whether they're tracking you properly. Because if they can track you properly, then they can calculate the loss of signal properly. And if it does turn out to be the right time, you have at least semi-warm feeling that you're on the right path. And so they had calculated 2 times. One where we got the burn and would scoot out from behind the moon faster because we increased our velocity. And another time where if something went wrong or it didn't light or we decided not to do it, it would be longer. And one of my jobs was to train the big antenna in the right position after, when we come out from behind. And we were so busy, after with a successful burn, we were so busy, and I was so busy taking pictures of this moon now moving away from us, that I forgot to shift the antenna. So we came out, no signal. And about the time I thought, oh my gosh, and I flipped the antenna around, happened to correspond with the no burn time. I had to buy drinks for those guys on the ground for a year. They were really worried. But then Jim said,
Yeah, I finally saved Bill because I said, "Houston, please be informed there is a Santa Claus."
Well, before we take you back home on Apollo 8, why don't we talk about your Christmas Eve broadcast as you were orbiting the moon?
We were told by Julian Scheer, who was the chief of publicity for NASA, that on Christmas Eve we would have the largest audience that had ever listened to a human voice. And I said, "Oh my goodness, what do you want? What should we do, Julian?" I was busy with other things, and the only instructions that we got from NASA was to do something appropriate. That to me has always been the epitome of what this country's all about. I was absolutely convinced if my name would have been Leonov or Titov or something, I would have been extolling the virtues of Stalin or Lenin or somebody else. But we were told to do something appropriate. I didn't want to waste a lot of time trying to figure out what was appropriate, so I contacted a friend of ours by the name of Cy Borgen and asked him if he could come up with something. He contacted Joe Layton. And Joe Layton and his wife finally came down after nobody could figure out what was appropriate, and suggested that we read from the first 10 verses of Genesis. So we printed it on the flight plan. I frankly didn't give a lot of thought to it.
Well, the reason was the first 10 verses of Genesis. Joe Layton was a newspaper man, so we thought that he'd be appropriate to come up with the prose. But the first 10 verses of Genesis is the foundation of many of the world's religions, not just the Christian religion. And Joe's wife said, there'd be so many people listening to this broadcast, and there are more people in other religions than the Christian religion around the world, and so this would be appropriate to that, and so that's how it came to pass.
And then we started home 3 days, and then came the reentry. Bill, why don't you tell them about the reentry?
well, I was going to say that when Frank is asked, what some of the great accomplishments of Apollo were, one of the things he mentioned was getting Bill Anders, then a practicing Catholic, to read from the King James Bible, version of the Bible. He's a JV Episcopalian, so.
Reentry.
Reentry. Yeah. Well, after we untangled a little difficulty about the orientation of the spacecraft a few hours before flight, whose name I won't mention, Cage the Gyro, we.
Talk about that if you want
That's
to.
all right. But it's very critical that you be at the exact right attitude. And fortunately, Frank and Jim bailed us out there. But I won't tell you who bailed us in. But anyway, my recollection is we're coming back 35,000 feet a second, way over any world speed record that had been set before, 7 miles a second, basically. And I remarked to Frank or Jim and said, gee, it looks like, are we getting sunrise? Or no, were we getting entry? And they said, oh, no, this is sunrise. And I said, well, if this is sunrise, we're going right into the sun. And it just got brighter and brighter and brighter. And pretty soon I felt like a bug that was somehow gotten inside a blowtorch flame watching this torch go. And as the G's build up, every now and then it looked like a big chunk would come flying off the heat shield. Well, when you see the meteors coming in, they light up very bright, but really they're just tiny little pebbles, and they ionize and make a big flash. I didn't think about that at the time, and I could just feel the heat coming through the spacecraft. And then we got down lower. We came in at night, first night re-entry. Then it got dark, and at 50,000 feet or so, the drogues fired, and we could feel a jerk. That was very reassuring. And then at 18,000 or something, the main chutes came out, 12,000, but we couldn't see them. And I think we needed 2 to make it,
Yeah.
And so it all seemed like one jerk. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, 3 chutes and 1 pull. That's not too good. But our Jim and Frank checked our vertical velocity, seemed to be in orbit. But when we hit, it was the biggest belly buster I've ever been on. And one of Frank's jobs was to flick a switch that would blow off the parachutes. But, we hit so hard, it just ripped his hand from the switch. And by the time he could recover, the chutes had pulled downwind and this thing was floating upside down. So I thought, here we were, conquering heroes from the moon, hanging from our straps, and all the trash that was in the spacecraft that had collected on the floor when we were coming in now was raining down on our face. So it was, that's one of my big recollections.
Well, we came in because why we hit so hard, the spacecraft was hanging from the parachutes at an angle. And the idea was that the edge of the spacecraft would slice into the water and sort of not make it a little bit easier for the landing. Well, it so happened that we were swinging on the shrouds of the parachutes, and also the wave action was such that they both matched so that we hit both things flat, and that's what caused the sudden hitting the water. And of course, the parachutes then pull us over to what is known as a stable 2, which meant that we are hanging upside down just on our straps, which is sort of an unusual way. And so Frank had to throw another switch that inflated about 3 balloons that slowly made us rotate up. And all this motion, of course, with Frank was another little disconcerting thing. And he couldn't wait to get out of that spacecraft to get back on that ship.
Yeah, but I managed to get seasick and throw up all over you again before I got out.
And the 2 Naval Academy guys just couldn't resist.
They were giving me all this nonsense about, I'm not a sailor, and thank God I wasn't, and I am not a sailor. But I got even with them because I sure puked all over them. I'm like,
Now you can imagine, Frank and I were on Gemini 7 a long time ago for a 2-week mission. 70% of the flight is over water. So you can imagine Frank's concern when he, getting close to 2 weeks, was all set to get down a little bit early so he could get near land someplace.
When we were floating in the sea, the helicopter, we could see it coming up in the dark or hear it, but they didn't jump in. And actually, they were shooting sharks because there were sharks around the spacecraft. And then when it dawned, these frogmen jumped in and swam up, and there was one young man, I could still recognize him with his face mask on. He'd come up and he'd wave, and then they installed a tube around the spacecraft, and the guy would give us a thumbs up, and then he'd go back and work, and his buddies. And Eventually, they had a couple of life rafts next to the hatch, and he went through with his tool, or somebody opened the hatch, and as this young man stuck his head in, he fell back. So later, when we got out, we went, and later turned out to be a Marine SEAL, and he was all lined up in his uniform when the spacecraft was recovered, and I went up to him and I said, young man, I said, thanks very much. I said, but when you fell back, was it the way we looked that surprised you? And he says, no, sir, it was the way you smelled.
Well, from that
On that
low
happy
note, I'd like our speakers to reflect a little bit upon when they got back and received this intense reaction from the public and the media, this wonderful feeling about what you'd accomplished. How did you think about your experience once you were back and began to talk with other people who witnessed and saw what you did on television and heard?
Well, I've reflected on it a lot more now than I did at that time. I think that the three of us were very, very fortunate Americans. 400,000 people put that thing together, 400,000 Americans. Several died in it, in the fire and in airplane crashes. I felt very, very, very blessed to be with Jim and Bill, because there was a wonderful camaraderie there.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, I know. I'm still mad about you doing that in the sauna, but nevertheless, it was a remarkable feeling, and I can remember as we stepped out on the carrier with that fresh ocean breeze and the flag flying there and the sailors all standing around. It was a feeling to me of overwhelming sense of gratitude for what we had been part of. The three of us got all the acclaim, or most of the acclaim, and the people that deserved it were all over, and certainly the giants in NASA. And most of them are gone now. I think Chris Kraft's the only one still alive. So, and then down to the lowest janitor, and I can remember we went through the factories all the time. I remember going through the autopilot factory at midnight, and a lady who must have weighed 300 pounds grabbed me and gave me a hug and damn near suffocated me and in her bosom and said, you don't worry a bit, because we're doing our job. And that was a wonderful feeling, and I just feel very, very privileged to have been a part of it.
Well, I agree with Frank, the fact that as soon as we got down, at least in my feelings, I didn't realize exactly what we had accomplished. I knew that we accomplished a successful first flight to the moon, but I didn't know the significance of it for the United States and for the world of what had happened. It takes time for these things to sink in. It takes a little bit of history and aging to say, hey, really what happened? How does this affect, our view of the country, especially as Martin had mentioned, 1968 was a very poor year in this country, and then we suddenly ended that year on a positive note, doing something positive for the country that everybody could take pride in.
And remember, as Frank has often said, Apollo was really not a program to explore the moon or develop technology. It was to beat the Soviets, to demonstrate our technological preeminence. As he said, another battle in the Cold War. And Apollo 8 and then certainly Apollo 11 underscored America's ability there and basically won that battle. And in a sense, great feelings about the accomplishment, but I frankly felt a little guilty because all of us had comrades and colleagues doing things that I thought were a lot more dangerous. Fighting in Vietnam, a lot of colleagues shot down, put in prison. El Dorado Canyon, raid on Libya. Frankly, I think Apollo 8 was probably a lot safer. And we were lucky to be part of it, as Frank said.
I agree with you. And, you stop thinking, look at John Glenn. 69 missions in World War II, and there's so many missions in Korea. And, if I hadn't been in Apollo, I would have wanted to been in Vietnam. Yeah. But we weren't. And we sort of got all the adulation and all the success and all the plaudits.
And there were so many people that were trying to serve this country under much more difficult circumstances. So I felt very humble and very grateful.
Okay. On that note, let's thank our speakers. We're going to have a few minutes of question and answers, but I think this has been a really wonderful panel discussion. There must be a few questions out there. I can see this one to start, so let's start here. And I will repeat your question so everyone can hear it.
In America, you're national heroes, as are a lot of the NASA astronauts. Do you go to other countries, and how do they respond to your flight?
Okay. To repeat, you are heroes in this country. How do other countries respond to what you accomplished in Apollo 8?
Well, after the flight, that was my last flight, and Jim and Bill were so busy, so I was sent over to Europe, and then the Soviets invited us to go through Russia, and we found nothing but friendship and the same kind of acclaim that we've got here in the United States. It was another gratifying experience to be able to represent the country when everybody was so proud of it. Not just Americans, but everybody.
Yes, go ahead.
I have spent a lot of time studying the space program, and I understand the tremendous amount of training that went into all of the missions. And I'd like to know what happened to all of the simulator records and the photographs and what have you. Have these been preserved?
Well, certainly the photographic records have. I don't know about simulator, but the photograph records, what do you call them? The proofs are untouchable. They made, I think, 10 copies of everything, and even those are very hard to get out. So NASA, I understand, has got a fantastic photo archive of our flight and others that they manage very, very carefully.
But I think this lady was talking about hardware and things of this nature. Of course, the Smithsonian, according to the Space Act, I believe, owns everything that NASA does not want to have, and then they can distribute it out to various museums.
Like watches and things like that.
Yeah. But if you're looking at things like the plans to build a Saturn V and the tooling, I think that's all gone. I don't think we could build a Saturn V today if we really wanted to.
Have you ever thought about what it would take to do what they did to the Cape? Think of the environmental impact statement. Hell, we'd still be working on it, 40 years later.
They'd be tagging alligators and rattlesnakes.
This is tough. Can I find a younger member of our audience who may have a question? Well, all right. We'll go with the New York Yankees up there. Has your experience in space changed your views about humanity or your religious beliefs?
Well, when you see the Earth from the moon about the size of your fist at arm's length, and you can imagine if you were, say, 10 lunar distances away, the Earth would be like this. And then as pictures from the Hubble and others come back and just show the immensity, we're on the left field, speaking of New York Yankees, of a rather measly galaxy, of which there are billions of galaxies with billions of stars. It's kind of hard to hold on to the thought that somehow we're the center of the universe and that, everything rotates around us. A lot of people still think that. Personally, I don't.
I understand we can take questions from out in the Milestones Gallery. Is there a way? Well, you get back to me on that, Gene, if we can do that. Anyway, let me rotate over here. This gentleman here. And yeah, go ahead. A white sweater, yes. Yeah.
You're the first humans to leave the Earth to such an extent. Do you by any chance remember when you returned? Was there some experience that helped you feel reconnected? Was there some experience out? Did you want to hike or something like that? Were you
once the astronauts returned to Earth, did they do something to reconnect with the planet?
Well, let me give it a try at answering that question. In the early days, NASA, of course, always took a psychiatrist out to the carrier to see if the astronaut coming back was spaced out or raptured to the depth or something like that. In my own personal experience, I was never disconnected with the Earth, even though I saw it from some 240,000 miles away. I always felt, it was part of me. And so when I came back, I felt it was a long voyage, but I never had that disconnected feeling.
Go ahead.
Well, he was always spaced out.
I never felt lost or anything else. I don't remember any they must have had a psychiatrist for you, because I don't remember talking about it.
When we were in training, this actually happened. I asked Frank, I said, well, when you and Jim were flying, what was the most memorable and satisfying part of your flight? And he said, stepping onto that carrier.
That's right.
Okay, up in the middle here.
I read in the history books that there was a problem with 3 of the 5 spacecraft windows in the command module, a laminate problem of some sort, and that the only 2 clear windows were the 2 rendezvous windows. Could you all expand on that a little bit? And also, how would you like the 3 of you to have future generations remember Apollo 8?
Okay. Well, I'll take the first one. During launch, the sealant around the windows, called RTV, oozed out and gassed onto the windows. I was lucky. I think mine was the clearest. Frank's was really gobbed up. Jim's was mediocre. And it really did cut back on the photography of the mission.
And the second part of that question about how would you like to be remembered?
That we made it.
Well,
first.
let me try to answer that. I think the best thing to have Apollo 8 remembered, especially by the young people growing up when they read it in the history books, is that we can accomplish just about anything if we put our mind to it, and we get together and work as a team with good leadership. That there's nothing that is, quote, impossible to do if we work hard at it.
I would submit that the way Apollo 8 will be remembered 300 or 400 years from now, first time human left the Earth. Period.
I'd like it to be remembered as a great effort by an American culture that was free.
Yep.
Have we worked out our transmission from Milestones yet? I guess not. Okay. It's funny to say.
The guy in the black sweater's got his ready to jump out of
He's
his
really
skin.
really stretched. All right.
Just when you were orbiting the moon, you're 60 miles above. Although you have lots of procedures and to follow. Any conversations about why don't we just go down there?
Well, we didn't have a lunar module.
Yeah, the question was, why don't you just go down to the surface of the moon?
That's the last place we wanted to go at that point.
Well, actually, on Apollo 10, I think they downloaded the fuel on the lunar module just so the guys couldn't do that, because they had a lunar module.
But that's where the psychiatrist comes in.
But I really would have liked to land on the moon, quite frankly.
Okay, the woman with red hair.